Today, I'm going to talk about learning from learning in recurrent neural networks. And so actually, probably if you're here listening to me, you know something about recurrent neural networks. And you also know something about learning. So you have some prior knowledge. And yet, hopefully, over this talk, you will learn something new. So this experience you will have of hearing me talk and seeing me move my hands around will give you some new knowledge. So combining prior knowledge with experience to new knowledge is what we call learning in a sense. And of course, this is neuroscience. So prior knowledge isn't out there in the ether. It's in some initial network state in my brain. And the experience, of course, the most important experience of your life is my talk. So therefore, that's what you have here. But you can alter it a bit and say that in general, you can think of a task, not a talk, that you have as the experience. And then with some plasticity, this combines to emergent structure and dynamics in your network. So hearing me talk or learning to perform some new task will alter either the connectivity or the dynamics of networks in your brain. And one interesting aspect about this is that even if I now stop and pull the plug and as an excuse of some technical difficulty and run away, already you heard me talk a bit and you know something that you perhaps did not know before, and maybe there is a bit of change to your circuits. And the interesting thing about learning is that this is an ongoing process. So to fully understand what's going on in the next hour, the initial state of your network is not the relevant initial state is not the one that you started with a few minutes ago, but it is an ongoing online process whereby the experience changes your network that then serves as the new initial network or the new prior for the ongoing learning. And this nice diagram is a nice diagram, but perhaps it hides the fact that I use these nice arrows as if I understand something about what's going on. But the reason I think it's interesting is that we hardly know anything about this. So there are many open questions about this diagram. So for instance, nature versus nurture. So if I have the initial network and the task, the prior and the experience, which one of them is more important for a particular setting? What is this emergent structure? When these things combine, then what type of connectivity changes? What type of dynamics emerge that implement the new learning and new knowledge? And if you think of this emergent structure, then this diagram I have is very deterministic in a sense. It looks as if for a specific network and a specific task, then there has to be one specific solution. But actually, when we learn things, there are a variety of strategies that different subjects or people can take to the same task. And how is such a strategy chosen? And again, this online nature, how does it affect our learning? How can we study it to understand multiple tasks? There are many open questions that I think are very interesting. But of course, I am not an experimentalist. Had I wanted to do experiments, I would have gone to somewhere that does not have a T in the title. And therefore, while eventually we would like to look at data, let us start with models. So why do you use models? Of course, it's fun and easy, but models help us capture something of the actual world, but they should be simple. And that's why we use them, because we can analyze them. And when we say simple, then simplicity usually means that we want to explain a component of a system. We have a complex system and we choose something to focus on. And it can be a physical component like a single neuron or a single area in the brain, or it can be functional, thing like a mode of a system. And the hope is that when we embed this component back into the system, its functionality is retained, and therefore when we connect the puzzle, we have learned something. But of course, the question, is it the case that functionality is retained? And in neuroscience, no. The answer is sort of no. If we look, and people have looked for many years at various components, let's say single neurons are the leading candidates, have been the leading candidates, then in many cases, when you look at the activity of a neuron in one setting and then you examine it in a different setting, everything breaks apart. So the parts that are often used in neuroscience do not retain their properties when put together. And that suggests that we might want to search new simple parts. And my favorite simple method for simple parts is trained recurrent neural networks. And the concept is very simple. You have a specific task in mind, let's say understanding my talk or something else. And then instead of thinking of what is the correct model and the right dynamics and the right connectivity of a network that has internalized my talk, you just specify this as some input-output function. Input is my talk, output is you clapping your hands vigorously, and then you just turn a crank of some machine learning algorithm, and out comes a network that can perform this task. And what's nice is because the network is in our hands, in our computer, we can then reverse engineer it and understand what's going on inside and discover how it works. So the reason to use these trained networks, at least the way I see it, are sort of two main reasons. One, it fits the data better. And two, we can learn something from it, new simples, new things that will be our models. So fits the data better, I will not talk about it a lot here. So there are works both for myself and others, both in recurrent networks and feed-forward networks. In recent years, there are many more. So there are many cases where this context-dependent or complex aspect of neuronal activities is captured naturally by these networks. And the more intriguing part, I think, is whether we can really learn something from it. And there are two different ways in which we can learn something from it. One of them is the final network. So, and in a sense, that's the classic way in which these networks were used, actually, in the when backpropagation was proposed. It came with a disclaimer that don't look at the process, only, this is a way to get a network that does something. How it got there, we don't care about it. But I want to focus today a bit more on the learning process itself, because the final network is interesting. We could be surprised by the solutions we get, and we can learn something from it. We can find a solution we did not expect. But the learning process means that even if we are not surprised, even if the final solution is what we could have expected a priori, we can still gain insight on the process of learning. And there's a nice quote from Rich Sutton that said, building in our discoveries only makes it harder to see how the discovering process itself can be done. And I think that it has something. So today I'm going to talk a bit about learning. And in a sense, again, I said I'm not doing experiments, but I think all the open questions I posed in the sort of experimental aspect hold for models. So we don't know the relation between initial network and task. We don't know which connectivity emerges and why, what are the dynamics that emerge, what is the space of solutions for a given task. And online learning, multiple tasks, that's a major research field. And there's a +1. And the +1, I told you that these networks fit to data. That I have this impressive list of many people that took a network, they trained it on an abstraction of a task that was done by an experimental animal. And then they looked at the neural activity of the network and the neural activity of the brain of the animal, and they were sort of similar. Why? I mean, how come? I mean, the network is obviously just a one network, and the animal is, I mean, there are obviously millions of ways to solve such a task and millions of ways to train such a network. How is it that they match? So this is something that I would like to touch upon today. Okay, so we'll start by doing by describing simulations of a task from the Jazeera that is studied in the Jazeera lab. And these simulations done by Elia Turner, a graduate student in the lab. And the task is ready, set, go, a timing task, and Elia trains networks using unconstrained learning, so backpropagation to time, basically. The task is as follows. The network receives two inputs, a ready input and a set input, and it has one output, which is go. And it goes like this, ready, set, go. So you get two inputs with a certain delay between them, and the task is to produce an output which has the same delay as the one you were presented with. And if the delay is longer, then the delay to the output is longer as well. So this is what we train networks to do. They receive many trials with various intervals. And then if we want to sort of quantify how they perform this, then we can compactly represent all the trials together. So if we have one specific trial of a certain delay, then it will go to this row over here. And then the ready is always at time 0, the set is at a certain time, and the go is the same delay later. And if we have many trials, then the correct response will just be these straight lines with a slope of 1.5. And here is how an actual network that was trained on the task performs, and you see it performs perfectly. So it learns this. And the natural question is how? How does it work? So my guess for the solutions, I saw a network that was trained to do this actually when I was in Colombia, and I immediately thought, oh, it's quite simple. I mean, probably the network somehow implements a counter in some abstract space. And when it receives this ready pulse, it counts up. When it receives the set pulse, it counts down. And when it reaches 0, then it emits a go pulse. This seems sort of a trivial solution, and it's impressive that the network found it, but probably this is what happens. The only problem is that I don't know whether this is what happens. So how do we know? To do this reverse engineering, to understand what's going on, there are many approaches, but in general, you can think that you can use the neural activity. And you can either observe neural activity and see whether it is consistent with your hypothesis, or you can perturb it. And likewise, you can observe behavior, or you can perturb behavior. So activity in this hypothetical scenario that I just mentioned would be that, let's say this is some PCA space or abstract space of activity, then activity following the ready, you move in some direction, then the set pulse will move you a bit to the side, and then you reverse the direction until you reach an area where you emit a go pulse. And had the set pulse been given a bit earlier, then you would have less time to the go pulse. Likewise, we can look at behavior. And one natural way to look at whether the network implements the solution I suggested is extrapolation. So the gray area signifies the training set. So in the Elia's case, she trained networks to a delay between 30 and 120 time steps. But what happens if we challenge the network and we ask it to respond to longer and longer delays between the ready and the set pulse? So a perfect network, my proposed network, wouldn't care. The counter will just go up and then go down. It will extrapolate perfectly. But what happens when you actually train networks? So Elia trained many networks of various architectures, and indeed, there were a few networks that had this perfect extrapolation, LSTM networks, by the way. But then there are networks that did something different. So this network sort of curved away. There are networks that curved away at a different point. There are networks that had this double response. There are networks that had wiggles. And there are networks that simply had too much wine before we did the simulation, and many, many more. So there's a whole zoo of different networks, and only one of them, actually a very small minority of them, look like what I had expected. So to make sense of this zoo, Elia defined a set of features for these response maps. And then they detected a few clusters, roughly 6 clusters of solutions. And then what she did is she looked at representatives of these solutions and tried to understand what's going on. For instance, this wiggly thing over here that came as quite a surprise to us. Well, what happens is that the network actually oscillates in a limit cycle. And in a sense, what happens is that that following the ready pulse, the network goes to this direction. A set pulse will give it to the will produce a go at the correct time. But all of these black curves are the training set. If you wait longer than the training set, then the trajectory curves back. And then depending on when exactly you give the pulse, you can get various delays in a periodic manner. In a different solution is this one, where you see that the delay between the ready and the set, the delay between ready and set, and the delay between set and go becomes longer and longer. So we train networks for, let's say, a delay of 100. But when you try to ask it for a 200 delay, it gives you a 300 delay, a longer one, as if it knows how to wait more. And the reason is that there is a saddle point over here, and there's a critical slowing down next to the saddle point. And if you go a bit too far, then you don't go to this go area at all, but to another fixed point, and then the network stops responding. And likewise, there are networks that enter limit cycles, but in this limit cycle, you have multiple outputs. So the go pulse is part of the limit cycle. And using this space of solutions allows us to ask questions, for instance, like this nature versus nurture. So we can take 100 networks that are divided into 10 different initial weights and 10 different orderings of trials, and then ask which one will determine the final cluster the network will reach. And it turns out in our case, initial weights largely determine what the final outcome or the final solution of the network will be. Although you can see that there are a few cases where the same initial weights, or here, this light green one, there are a few cases where the same initial weight can lead to two different outcomes. And actually, if you follow a single network that was initialized at a single initial weight, and then you follow it along the training trajectory, then most of the times it will remain within a cluster. But occasionally, it will switch between clusters. And it turns out that this can be approximated by a Markov process. And there is a specific regularity to the transitions between clusters. So the saddle point will not transform to a limit cycle, but will rather disappear and then have a limit cycle. And then the limit cycle will come to encompass the go or not encompass the go. So there is a certain regularity to this space of solutions that we can now reveal. Okay, so what Elias showed is that once you use a complex task, you can reveal this space of solution. And with this concept of a space of solutions, we can ask many questions. We can see that the initial weights heavily bias this solution of choice. We did not show it here, but the architecture biases the solution, the GRU versus LSTM versus vanilla. And using extrapolation or perturbations in general, either behavioral or neural, can reveal the hidden properties of solutions. So we had many questions, and I think some of them were already answered here. So we touched upon nature and nurture. We saw how dynamics such as fixed points and limit cycle emerge with training. We saw that there is a space of solutions, and this closed loop effect, or the online learning, showed us this Markov transition. And the fit to data, I think this makes an interesting point, that had we taken one of these networks and tried to fit them to data, well, some of them would have failed because they are themselves very different. This means that the different, so there's a nice recent work from David Cecil where they showed a universality, that training many networks had a topologically universal solutions. And in our case, there was no universality. And that means that it might be possible to select, using the data, the type of solution that a particular subject arrived to. And we are now working on methods to do that. Okay, so this complex task exposes many things, but it's very hard to understand why this happened. I mean, why did certain connectivity emerge? Why does the initial structure affect task performance? And to do that, I'm now going to move to more simple tasks that will allow more analytical insights into these phenomena. So first, I want to briefly talk about the connection between initial network state and the task. And this is work done by Lee Sussman, a graduating student in the lab, and Francesca, a postdoc from UCL, with Nama Brenner, a colleague here at the Technion. And the question was, do network statistics prefer certain tasks? So usually we think of these recurrent neural networks as, they're universal approximators. Whatever task we throw at them, they'll do it. But are there, better or worse tasks? And we use a very simple task. It's a sine wave, a very simple network. It's a reservoir with feedback. So we have a typical recurrent network with input and output. And the task is just a sine wave. The subtitles, for those who need them, this is a rate network in continuous time. And the input will either be the target in open loop or the output in a closed loop setting. And what I want to show you here is that if I take the same network and I now train a sine wave, and all I do is I try to ask for a higher frequency, then you can see it's a bit hard to see perhaps, but it starts getting a bit worse towards the end. And if I ask it for a lower frequency, then actually it fails. So the performance of the network, this specific network, is different for different frequencies. And we can do this for different learning rules, either least square or ridge or recursive least square. And in all of them, we see that there is an optimal frequency at which the network performs best. Now, it can perform quite well for a large range of frequencies, but it has a preferred frequency, and the preferred frequency decreases as the connectivity strength G of the network, the gain of the network, increases. And this is for all the training rules. Now, to understand why this happens, we move to linear networks. And what we saw there is that when we drive the network in an open loop setting, then the network, because it's a sine wave, then the network does this ellipse in neural space, in phase space. And we can solve exactly the vectors that compose this trajectory. And notice that their geometric properties have this resonance, if you will, or optimal frequency, in which the dimensionality, which we measure with participation ratio, is maximal. And when we take this, so linear networks in principle can do this perfectly. So what we can do is measure how far away their eigenvalues are from being perfect, or if we put some noise, how will they perform? So we have various measures of performance in these linear networks, and roughly they all go according to this prediction, which says that the maximal dimensionality of the representation determines the optimal performance, or more generally, the statistics of the network dictate a suitability of the task. So not all tasks go with all networks, but there are some preferences. So the initial network selects some task properties, and this can be understood using either the geometry in the open loop, single neuron properties, which I did not show, or the spectrum in the closed loop, which actually I didn't show either. Okay, all of these were with a very constrained setting. So this was a sine wave, and this, I had the feedback loop, which was a rank 1 perturbation. And the question is whether we can understand something about the initial network state in a more general scenario. And to do that, this is work of Friedrich Schlussler, a graduate student in the lab, together with Francesca Mastrogiuseppe, Sergeant Ostojic, and Alexis Dubreuil. And what they did is take networks and do unconstrained training. So train all the weights, not just a feedback loop, using gradient descent. So now we don't have we train all the networks, but then the weights, by definition, we have some initial connectivity, and we have the connectivity after learning. So we can define a delta W, which is what happened after learning. And then we can analyze this delta W and see whether there is some structure to it. Okay, so first, we look at delay discrimination, also known as the Romo task. And in this task, there are 2 input pulses, and the task is to know whether, and they are delayed in time. And the task is to say whether the first one is larger than the second one, or vice versa. And when we train these networks, we can train them either using networks that have 0 initial connectivity, and this is the curve over here, or G equals 0.9. This is the light curve. So the same task, the same learning rule, but we're going to use 2 different initial conditions. And you can see that when G is large, learning is much faster. But then we want to know what is learned. What is the structure that was learned? So we are going to do a singular value decomposition of the delta. Again, not of the entire connectivity, of the delta connectivity. In the dark green case, of course, it's the same because the initial connectivity is 0. And what we observe is that the singular values drop very rapidly. Now, it's hard to say exactly how, what is the cutoff here. And also, the fact that they drop very rapidly is, it's a structural observation, not a functional one. So to check whether they are functional, what we did is we truncated the connectivity, the delta connectivity, and only retained 1 or 2 or 3 and so on of the delta W, and then evaluated the performance of the network. So this functional measure showed that roughly rank 5 or 4 perturbation is sufficient to learn the task. So again, we did not constrain the network to learn a low rank perturbation, but this is what it converged to. And this was true for the Romo task. It was true for the Mante task and for a flip-flop task. In all cases, this is unconstrained learning, and the network converged to a low-rank perturbation to connectivity. And in all cases, learning with a higher G was faster than learning with a 0G. So initial connectivity accelerates learning, and the learned connectivity is low rank. To understand the origins of these phenomena, we move to a linear network. So in this case, the dynamics are linear. So x dot is has x and not phi of x. And the task is very simple. We're going to have a fixed input, u equals 1, and we want to demand a fixed output, which is z hat. And then what we do is we, after the network learns, then it will reach a fixed point that has the correct output. So we train networks, and again, unconstrained, using gradient descent. And what we see is the same phenomenon. So if we have a larger G, then we have a faster learning. And what we can also see here is that when we have a larger initial connectivity, the singular value is smaller. Okay, so both faster learning and it reaches a smaller value, the singular value. This is true both for two different values of z hat. By the way, you can see that for large z hat, a second singular value, which is very, very small, begins to emerge at some point. Now, the nice thing about this is that we can solve these dynamics. So we can write the gradient descent dynamics because the network reaches a fixed point, which we can write an exact expression for. And then we have what's known as the gradient flow, which is the moving along this infinitely small learning rate. And the time, the tau is now the learning time, or the epochs. So what we can do is we can expand. So, okay, I can write this equation. I cannot solve it completely, but what I can do, or what Friedrich can do, is expand this in learning time as a series. And I can compute these coefficients, and what we see is that the rank 1 is what changes at the first order. So initially, we have a rank 1 connectivity, and this rank 1 connectivity decreases the loss and allows us to approximate the time it will take the network to learn. So what we can see is that the convergence time decreases with the initial connectivity strength, actually due to two factors. Both the final change, so remember I showed you that the singular value was smaller with a large G compared to a small g, and it turns out the gradient itself is larger. So you're moving faster towards a smaller target. And together, this gives the 1 minus g squared acceleration. By the way, the reason for this acceleration is that this low rank component is correlated to the bulk, to the initial connectivity. And this is, so this effect of correlated low rank is in this first paper mentioned here. Okay, one final thing is online learning. So again, using these simple tasks, we can ask questions about not only the effect of the initial network as we learn one task, but what happens when we build one task on top of the other. So to do that, we do a task which is 2-bit flip-flop. So we have an input that can push us to either a plus or a minus in one channel and a plus or a minus in a different channel. And what you see on the top is a network that has learned task A, this is the first pair. And you see the loss going down. This is the blue curve. Then the network learns task B. And you see the orange curve over here go down. But we are testing the memory of task A simultaneously. This is the blue curve that goes up and shows that the network forgot or had this catastrophic forgetting, and it ruined the memory of task A. Conversely, if G is higher, 1.2, then you see that, first of all, you have the accelerated learning, just as we saw before, but also the memory is retained to a large degree. So for some reason, when we do this with the initial state, not only accelerates learning, but also protects previous knowledge. And the reason this happens is we can dynamically track the mechanism here. So what I'm plotting here is sort of an energy function. So x dot is the dynamics. And the norm of the dynamics, which I call Q, is something that is 0 for fixed points and can be a local minimum for slow points. And if we have fixed point, then it is 0. So what happens is that if we look at the top line, after we learn the first task, we have 2 fixed points. But then when we present the second task, these 2 fixed points start rotating. And eventually we have 2 fixed points, but we do not retain the old ones. In contrast, when G is larger, then what happens is that 2 new fixed points emerge while retained. So the phase space is sort of stretched. And therefore the existing dynamics are retained. And in a sense, what happens here mechanistically is that there are 2 sources of error. What happens is that when we start the second task, the dynamics quickly converges to the old wrong fixed points. And then the error starts to move them away. But simultaneously, you have the input, which is another input, and that pushes you in another direction. So these 2 sources of error compete, and the initial connectivity makes a trade-off between them. And this is a bit reminiscent of work by Samuel Gershman and others about, you could say, novelty or the distinction between when to form a new memory and when to modify an existing one. So in principle, if you have a small error, you would like to modify, you think that your model is correct, but mistuned. And if you have a large error, you think that your model is wrong and you should get a new one. And this sort of novelty detection might be related to these initial statistics of the network. Okay. So what I hope you have learned or experienced. Complex neural signatures suggest complex models. So although we would like simple models, maybe we need other ones. And perhaps surprisingly, a good model for an adapting complex system like the brain might be an adapting complex system like a trained recurrent neural network. But to understand these models requires some new concepts. And both the learning process, which I talked about today, and the final outcome can be analyzed. And one concept that I think is very promising is this space of solutions, because this can be a framework to understand learning. Once we have this space, we can ask many, many questions within it. What biases the solution to, what biases the network to go to one solution or the other? Can we intervene? Can we put a catch trial that will push us to a different solution at the right time? If we compare to data, then where does the data fall in our space of solution? And I think these networks can also offer us new simple objects to analyze, not just in the neurons. These dynamical objects like slow points and fixed points, in a sense, they are the prior. They are what forms the bias. So what happens is that learning generates a certain dynamical object, and this dynamical object serves as the prior for future learning, just as we saw with this rotating fixed points. And also there's work we did on navigation that sort of explicitly builds in this prior. If we think of online learning, then these dynamical objects, as we saw, the limit cycle that cannot immediately go to a saddle point but has to move through intermediates, then that can sort of inform us about the type of transitions that we can expect and cannot expect. And then, yeah, there's also other work we did that sort of shows how this online learning affects forgetting within a trial and not just across trials. Finally, this low rank. So low rank, I was acquainted with low rank as a trick. You know, we have recursive least squares, forced learning, and this makes reservoir computing. This makes life very easy when you train. But actually, it emerges naturally, even when you do unconstrained learning. And actually, it sort of makes sense, because if you think of a complex system like the brain, or like a cell or an organism, it doesn't really matter. But if you have a complex system that communicates with its environment through a narrow communication channel, then that sort of means there has to be an effective feedback loop that moves from the high-dimensional internal dynamics through this communication channel into the world and back. And mathematically, this is a low-rank perturbation. So it's quite natural that this actually emerges. And there's also some work we did that shows that topology and scale-free topology is also similar in a sense to low-rank perturbed networks. So learning from learning can be fun, I think. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you very much.